In much the same way I did a video on the characteristics of Charles the Bald, I'm now going to do a video on the characteristics of Charles the Bald's oldest brother, Lothair I, who was Holy Roman Emperor between 843 and 855. Lothair had always been a contentious figure. He had usurped his own father, Louis the Pious, on two different occasions, and he held Louis the Pious and his youngest brother, Charles the Bald, prisoner on two different occasions, on the occasions that he had usurped Louis the Pious, as it were. But Lothair was not good at governing, and both those occasions proved to be a disaster, and Louis the Pious was eventually restored to power. When Louis the Pious was dying in 840, he outlined his visions for the division of the Frankish kingdom. But it was only going to be Charles the Bald that was going to attempt to respect that. Lothair had no such intentions of respecting his father's wishes, and even though he became kind of the main man in the Frankish kingdom, he set his sights then on snatching the lands that were held by his two brothers, Charles the Bald and Louis the German in the east. For 3 years, Lothair essentially pestered the life out of Louis the German and Charles the Bald, so much so that Louis the German and Charles the Bald had to unite against him, and they even had a extremely bloody battle at Fontenoy in 841. The fact that Charles the Bald and Louis the German united against Lothair shows you how headstrong Lothair must have been, because when Lothair died in 855, Louis the German and Charles the Bald then spent decades fighting with each other. So their relationship was not a particularly good one. But so overbearing was Lothair becoming that they felt they were left with no other option. But what's interesting, particularly about Lothair I, though, is that after the Treaty of Verdun in 843, which really outlined the territories that each of the three brothers held, he seems to have calmed down, so to speak, and his relationship with Charles the Bald, who held the West, seems to have improved somewhat. There's not so much talk about his relationship after 843 with Louis the German, although Louis the German, after Verdun, seems to have become a bit more of an agitator, and it's he that seems to have been the one that has gone on the attack. So perhaps he never fully trusted his brothers, so to speak. But talking about Lothair for a minute, the way his sort of attitude is changed, really, and he starts to use diplomacy better, and he even becomes godfather to Charles the Bald's daughter, which shows you that he was starting to grow up, and even though by this point he was pushing 50, so he's an interesting man. After 3 years of, well, not after 3 years really, after decades of causing nothing but havoc in Europe, he seems to have reached a point in the mid-840s where he's actually shown a little bit of common sense. What may have forced Lothair's hand is the fact that there were growing threats in continental Europe. First of all, the Viking invasions were getting stronger, and in Italy, Lothair's son, Louis II, was facing attacks from Muslims who were not only infringing in Italy, but they were also claiming territory. And in fact, Lothair had to intervene on Louis II's behalf, which would have been almost embarrassing for Louis II, really, because Lothair had to effectively undermine his authority but ultimately it was for the greater good. Towards the end of his life, Lothair went into a monastery and took on the life of a monk for the remaining weeks of his life. Whether this was a sign of his repentance for his treatment of his younger brothers and his father, I don't know. But the last decade of his life, he has become actually quite a good ruler. And actually, he's managed to reclaim territory in Italy that had been lost. He's using diplomacy better. He's, to an extent, mended relations with Charles the Bald. So it's interesting to me that a man who could have been so divisive in his early life has ended up becoming a capable and functioning king or emperor. Unfortunately for Lothair, I nearly called him Louis. Unfortunately for Lothair the First, he has largely been forgotten about. I think Charles the Bald is better remembered simply because of his nickname. Lothair the First has largely long since been forgotten about, and he's another one of those European rulers that have just reigned during the attacks of the Vikings. And that's ultimately kind of whitewashed him from history. But just writing about the Holy Roman Emperors is making me see that there's a lot more to their character than just figures in a book, if you see what I'm saying. They're interesting characters, but sadly, these 8th, 9th, 10th century European emperors, kings, have largely gone overlooked. And so that's why I thought I'd just do some informal videos on their characteristics. And just to discuss briefly about people like Lothair and Charles the Bald, that they were actually quite complex, particularly Lothair. Charles the Bald is actually quite straightforward, I think. He seems to have been a man who was quite diplomatic. Their other brother, Louis the German, he's a bit more like Lothair, but he's somebody that I don't think is fully trustworthy. But to an extent, he's quite straightforward as well, because you can put him in that box of not being somebody you'd ever fully trust. But Lothair is quite complicated. He goes from being completely untrustworthy to actually being a good ruler. So it's just unfortunate for him that he didn't show a bit more maturity in his early years, and then he might have been remembered for being a admirable figure in 9th century Europe. Unfortunately, though, he's just become one of a number of actually important figures in European history that have just been almost just completely and totally forgotten. So that is why I'm doing some work on the Holy Roman Empire, is to bring these people back to life, so to speak, because I think people like Lothair the First do deserve to be talked about.